Whoa. That sounds like I'm on. Our study. Woo! All right. All good? I feel like now there's an echo. Yes. All right. All complaints can be filed at Chrissy Smith at Chrissy.Smith. All right. Let's move forward here. So we're in Exodus. Okay, we're going through our studies in Exodus. We're going through the Bible, if you remember. This is like a 3 or 4 year thing through called the Gospel Project. And if you remember last week, one of the things I really stressed, we kind of built up to it the last few weeks, is I kind of took over about mid Genesis from Pastor Carl, and is that the Bible is a story that leads to Jesus. It's all about Jesus. Okay, you have what we call the Old Testament that leads up to Jesus. You have the Gospels, which are about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and then you have the epistles, the Revelation and things which are that point back to Jesus. Okay, so everything is about Jesus. So as we get into the lesson this morning, we're gonna kind of explore that a little bit more. Okay, how these things are point to Jesus, are part of God's plan, and do have wisdom for us today also. So if you would turn to Exodus 13, that's where we're going to start. We'll be in 13 and 14 this morning. And the theme of today, right, is God saves his people. And we're going to talk a little bit about salvation and deliverance, especially towards the end of the lesson. But really we're going to explore everything from God's providence to God's deliverance, God's activity in our life, okay? So we're going to look at all of this. So if you would turn to Exodus 13, we're starting in verse 17. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them along the road to the land of the Philistines, even though it was nearby. For God said, the people will change their minds and return to Egypt if they face war. So he led the people around toward the Red Sea along the road of the wilderness. And the Israelites left the land of Egypt in battle formation. Okay, which is interesting because they're not an army. This is just a people group, right? So they leave in battle formation, and God's leading them out of Egypt. He leads them in battle formation, and then he leads them away from battle, right? So there's two roads, two ways they could have go here. The shortest route to where they were headed is along what we call a highway called Via Marias. Okay, Via Marias, it was a section of road that led out of Egypt. Not a highway like we would think today, right? Think of it more like a well-traveled walking path. Okay, and this section is the shortest point from A and B, from Egypt, Promised Land, shortest point. The problem is they went through a territory that was essentially bordered the Philistines' land. Okay, now if you know anything about the Philistines, they're a people group that the Israelites clash with numerous times in the Old Testament. Right, this is the people that produced Goliath. Okay, we'll get to that story. That's a fun story. We'll probably be like a year by the time we get there, but we're gonna get there. We'll look at that story. But the Philistines are a people that were known for war and battle, and especially against neighboring townships, if you will. So God leads them away from this and leads them the long way around. And there's a map here. I don't have it to throw up, but it is the long way around. Okay, no doubt. He leads them towards the Red Sea, which we're going to see is important here in a second, and leads them away from battle. And I find this interesting. He says the people will change their minds. This is verse 17. The people will change their minds and return to Egypt if they face war. All right? So God knows something that even the Israelites don't. Right? He knows that if I lead them there, if I lead them along that path, there's going to be a war. And they're not ready for war. He leads them in battle formation, but yet he knows they are unprepared for war. Right? I think of it as maybe the early days of getting, I'll use Cole as an example, he's a band teacher. When that first week of school, are you guys ready for competition? But don't you kind of get them all in their places where they need to be? They're in a formation where they could play music, right? They could be an orchestra. Are they going to sound like an orchestra, especially if it's the first wave of kids ever coming in and playing band? Because it's junior high band, right? Definitely not ready, right? But they look the part, right? And that's kind of how I picture this here, is that they look the part. They look like they're ready to go, but God knows they're not ready to go, right? And he takes them the long way around. And we're going to see the Israelites catch on to this being the long way around. And there's a long history of complaining that starts right about here. But as I sit here and I look at this, I think about this point that God is directing his people where they're to go. And on paper, if you're an Israelite, you're going, I want to go here. Right? I'm a very practical person. My wife's not sitting in here right now, but she would definitely, I'm extremely practical. I need to get to point A, or point B from point A, straight line. Well, that's not the best straight line, okay? That's what I want to go directly there, right? And yet God says, no, the best path is here, down here, through here, around here, back to here, through here, up to here. Okay, now you're there, right? And I think of this, and I can't help but think about just our own lives as I think of this. And it really doesn't tie as much to the rest of the story that we're going to get into, but I think it's so important that when we understand that when God directs us, it's often not the path that we plan to take. Right? Sometimes that's the long way around. And that's frustrating, isn't it? Sometimes. Now, you have to understand something. Moses is not putting pen to paper here in Exodus as they're doing this trip. Right? This is, I won't get into the whole how oral tradition turns into writing and all of that, but this is a recap of a story. Okay? This is a recap of what happened. So otherwise, they're looking back on the situation now, at the time this is being written, and going, oh, that's what God was doing. If we would have gone that way, I mean, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years here in the future, and they couldn't even get their own food. God had to provide that. They weren't ready for war, but they couldn't even get their own food, much less fight a battle, right? And here they are, God leading them this long way around, and they're looking back on this story going, here was the purpose. Sometimes we don't understand that purpose. We don't understand that why until much later, right? Sometimes much, much, much later, right? Sometimes we look back at things that happened in our life where God led us certain directions, and as we're going through it, all we can do is question why. This doesn't make sense. There's nothing good coming from this. There's no fruit. I don't get it. But yet we know Romans 8:28 tells us that God works all things to the good for those who are called according to his purpose. Right? And so it's frustrating because we look at these situations and God, Romans 8, like, where are you at? I don't see you here. But you have to remember the Israelites are writing about something that has happened in their past. They're writing with fresh eyes. They know now, man, if God would have led us that direction, we would have fought. The Philistines had been fighting for years. The Israelites had been slaves. It was not going to go well. Okay? It was not. So God led them and directed them to a path that was for their benefit, even if it did not seem like it at the time. That's hard for me, because I look at the things that I've gone through in my life and some of the problems that happened to me, some of the problems I created, and I go, God, why did you allow this to happen? In some cases, now I can look back and go, oh. And sometimes I'm like, answers? I still don't have any answers. But understand this, that when God directs his people, it's the path that best needs to be traveled for his plan, not the fastest, quickest, easiest route to get there. That's tough. It's hard to swallow because we're practical people. We like to go the fast way, especially our generation, right? I know that Houston is like an hour away from Houston, but we still, we like to get somewhere quickly, right? We like to go. I'm going to jump in my car. I'm going to go to wherever. I'm going to maybe go get some food. It's going to be fast. Even if I go in and wait, it's going to be fast, right? Yeah, has to be no kids, right? Yeah, good luck with that. You paid your dues, though, okay? Round of applause. Date night for the Garcias. Yeah. That, believe me, in my life, that is a date. Well, we're going to shop. We'll shop at Walmart. Date. Okay, totally a date. Okay. So we see this already, God directing something that the Israelites would not have planned for themselves, but yet God is accomplishing it. It's not the fast route. It's not the easy route, but it is the right route. That's hard because sometimes we say easy and right should go together. And that's not what happens here. Okay? So he moves them along. We see verse 19. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the Israelites swear a solemn oath, saying, God will certainly come to your aid. Then you must take my bones with you from this place. They set out from Succoth and camped at Etham at the edge of the wilderness. Now, this is interesting, and this is a bit of a footnote, but we learn in Hebrews that this is an example of Joseph's faith. We see the promise in Genesis that Joseph's bones are going to go to the promised land. God promises this to Joseph. And so we see this, Moses is fulfilling the plan. Now, this is just cool and interesting tidbit fact. So there's an archaeologist named David Roll. Anyone know who David Roll is? Anyone? Yeah. He's an Egyptologist, and he wrote several books, but he wrote one called Pharaohs and Kings, and it focuses a lot on Joseph a bit. And there is a tomb in the land of Goshen, right, where they were, that has a Semitic or Jewish character. This is an Egyptian land where there's a statue of a Jewish character with a multicolored coat. Like, you can look this up. This is an archaeological fact. His face has been kind of smashed because anti-Jewish type opinions over time. And in this tomb, this courtyard, there are 12 other tombs. How many brothers did Joseph have? 12? Interesting. And there's different courtyards that make it very similar to the story of Joseph. But what's interesting is the main tomb has been dug up and the bones are missing. That is interesting. Because the bones of Joseph, according to the Bible, should no longer be there. They have been taken to the promised land. In fact, we think we know where they are buried today. And I find that interesting. It's a cool, sometimes we get caught up in the beauty and the majesty of Jewish writing, and we picture these cartoonish almost settings of what happens, and we forget that there are some archaeological evidence to support some of the things that we're talking about here. Okay, and that to me, that's one of the cooler ones. And if you're into that kind of stuff, Pharaohs and Kings by David Roll, great book. I've actually, again, only listened to the podcast. I need to finish reading the book, but it was really, really interesting. So that's why this is mentioned here, is because Joseph is being taken here. But I also want to point something else out. Joseph was promised the promised land. Abraham was promised the promised land. Jacob and Isaac were promised the promised land. Did any of them see the promised land? No. See, the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, it's the hall of faith. Y'all know that chapter we're talking about? That's actually what it's about, right? We see Hebrews 11:1, and it's like, it's all about faith, right? Faith is believing what you do not see, right? Well, we kind of take that verse out of context sometimes. What that verse is talking about is that what was not seen was God's promise come to fulfillment. Sometimes we don't see the promise come to fulfillment, but it doesn't mean the promise is not fulfilled. Right? And that's really what faith is. Faith is trusting God when you don't even see the light at the end of the tunnel. That's hard, isn't it? That's hard. Not seeing the light at the end of the tunnel and having to trust God. So, Continue on, verse 21. The Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to lead them on their way during the day, and in a pillar of fire to give them light at night. So what they could travel day or night. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night never left its place in front of the temple. So God is not only directing them, he didn't just tell them which way to go, he is leading them. He is leading his people. And he's leading them in a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. Does anyone know what the significance of those are? Or anyone take a guess? Okay, you have the symbol of night and day, absolutely. We're going to actually talk about light and darkness in just a second, and how those are a good example there, so that's very good. What is, we often see God's presence come down in a cloud in the Old Testament. We often see God's presence take the position of fire in the Old Testament. Does anyone know what those two things symbolize? What does a cloud symbolize when God comes down in a cloud? There's a certain word we use. I know Moises will know it. It starts with an S. Shekinah. It's a Shekinah, but it's the Shekinah glory. The cloud represents God's glory. Right? You see this in the Isaiah as he's seeing the vision, right? The smoke or the cloud fills the temple that he's in, right? That's God's glory that's being presented there. Then the fire. What does the fire represent? What attribute of God do you think? No? Good guess, though. Huh? Good guess, no? Remember, when God showed up in the burning bush, what did he make Moses do? Why? Holy ground. That's exactly right. So you have this example of God's holiness and his glory. Right? So we see this theme of his holiness and his glory throughout the Old Testament. And we see that it's his holiness and his glory that is leading and directing them. Okay? And so those are some important things to know. So God is leading them. Okay? He's leading them in a long way around. Not the path they want to take, but God is the one providing direction. This is where things get interesting. Exodus 14, starting in verse 10. Exodus 14, starting in verse 10. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there was Egyptians coming after them. The Israelites were terrified and cried to the Lord for help. They said to Moses, "Isn't it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done by bringing us out of Egypt?" So how long did this faith of the Israelites last? Not long. Not long. Hey, no jokes. We are them. Okay? We are them. We are the same exact way. That's right, right? Yeah, exactly. Like God did something great. Oh my goodness, something bad happened. And it's like, does he even exist? Believe me, that is me in a nutshell. Okay, that is me in a nutshell. So here they are. As soon as they see the Egyptians, the Pharaoh has changed his mind. He is coming after the Israelites. He's going to destroy them. He's going to wipe them out. As soon as they see the first sign of trouble, they're being led by a pillar of fire and cloud. And the first sign of trouble, they turn to Moses and like, do you not note the sarcasm there? People say there's not humor and sarcasm in the Bible, and that's just not true. It's everywhere. It's great. And they turn to Moses and like, oh, is it because there's no graves in Egypt that you brought us out here? So we can die here and get buried here? Like, it wasn't good. Oh, you didn't want to kill us in Egypt. You wanted to kill us out here. Okay, I get it. Makes sense. They're being smart Alex, right? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Now, here's the thing. Did Moses bring them out of Egypt? No, God did. Right? Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. Yeah, you're the scapegoat. All right? There's always someone to blame, right? And they're going, you did this to us, Moses. You convinced us there's this God creature thing, and he's leading us out of here, and it's your fault. We're all going to die. And believe me, the complaints don't stop. Okay? And again, I don't say this to push down the Israelites. We are the Israelites. We are them. This would be us. Okay? As humans, that's right. That's exactly right. they immediately complain. Okay, this is a recurring feature throughout the wilderness. When difficulties arise, they paint their past in glowing terms, ignoring reality. In other words, when we're going through a hard time, right? Especially if that hard time is growth. Right? I'm like preaching to myself here. Okay, when I'm going through growth, I know that we're all older. We're done growing. I wish I wasn't, because I didn't achieve my height goals in life. But amen. Yeah, you and me both, Cole. You and me both. But here's the thing. When we were teenagers, we grew. You ever work out with growing pains? Your kids, do you at least remember any of your teenage boys or girls growing up with growing pains? Yeah. I remember having growing pains, and I didn't even grow that much. Okay. So growth is painful. Growth is painful. Your body's like literally stretching out, and it's also true emotionally, physically, mentally, and spiritually. Growth can be painful. Very painful. And yet, what we see here is that what we often do when we're being stretched, there's some pain. Right? We look back at times that were more comfortable, even if it was not a good position to be in, and we go, "That's where I want to be again," because it was comfortable. So they're looking back on that, going, "Man, I want to be back in bondage and slavery." They literally tell Moses later on in the story we'll get to, Can we just go back to Egypt? The good times. When we were slaves? Can we just go back there? When we had no rights, no freedom, couldn't worship who we wanted to? Can we go back to that time? Hey, that's as Mary pointed out, that's kind of how we are as human beings. That's how we are. Moses answers, though. This is a great reply. He says, "Don't be afraid," this is verse 13, "stand firm and see the Lord's salvation that he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you must be quiet." That's hard. Anyone here like a doer? Like you have to be doing something? You feel like you're not making progress. That's me. I'm a project manager by like birth and by career. Okay, it's just who I am. I like to manage things, get things in order, see a plan come to fruition, have contingencies, work those out, right? And what I found in life is none of that matters. Okay, none of that matters. But instead, here's what he tells them to do. Don't be afraid. Stand firm. See the Lord's salvation, his deliverance. Salvation, sometimes we overuse that word, especially here in the Bible Belt. The word means deliverance. Okay, we're being delivered. They were being delivered from bondage, from their enemies. Again, this is all an image pointing forward to us, right? How we're delivered from our bondage, from our enemy. And what did the Israelites have to do to get that deliverance, to get that salvation? Not a darn thing. Yeah, be quiet. The word there is really interesting, quiet, because the Hebrew language is not the English language, so the word actually means like plow, but because of some euphemisms in the language, it also has this idea of not doing the work, right? Because they were plowing. You're the passive party. The cow, the beast, is pulling the plow. You're kind of just guiding it along. So it came with this idea of being the passive party or the quiet one, silent. Also translated sometimes at being at rest or at peace. Okay, I know that's not how our language works, but that's how it worked in Hebrew. So he says, the Lord will fight for you, you must be quiet. Otherwise, to use an example of plowing, the animal is going to work for you, you just got to walk behind it. Right? You just got to hold the plow, you just got to keep it steady. Keep it between the lines. The animal is going to do the work. So what Moses is telling the Israelites here is that you just keep it in between the lines, God's going to do the work. Okay? God's going to do it. God fights for his people. Deliverance comes through God, not through our own actions. The Israelites did nothing. If they were left to their own devices, the Egyptians would have come and wiped them out. If they had to go fight the Philistines, if they had to turn around and fight the Egyptians, they were going to lose. And so what happened, and God understands this, and he says, I will do this. I will fight for you. You must be quiet. Again, the Old Testament, everything in it points to Jesus. So as we look at this and we see this, how do we apply this to Jesus? Well, we see that Jesus fought for us. He provided the deliverance. There's nothing you and I did. People say, well, yeah, but you had to accept him. I can tell you, in the grand scheme of earning my salvation, the grand scheme of earning my right standing before God, if all I have to do is accept it, then all I've done is keep it between the lines. God did the work. He provides the deliverance. Guys, you serve a God that will fight for you. Has already fought for you. Okay? You are delivered. If you are here this morning and you know God, Jesus is your personal Lord and Savior, okay? You have a relationship with God, you trust God, and we're going to talk about how much trust is needed. Spoiler alert, very small. Very small. If that is you this morning, the battle has been fought. If you're online this morning, and if you're here or online this morning, and you're saying, well, that's not me, I've yet to trust God, don't worry, the work has already been done. Now you just have to keep it between the lines. And I'm not talking about morally doing good things. I'm talking about just trusting God. That's it. Trusting God. He will fight for you. You must be quiet. Now, that's hard. It's hard for me. I don't like to be quiet. God gave me big ears, but I like to use my mouth. Okay? I like to talk. I like to be involved, to be active. God says, no, be quiet. Stop trusting yourself. Stop looking at the external situation. It reminds me of Peter a little bit, walking on the water, right? Looking at everything around him, going, I'm not going to make it. Well, yeah, you were never supposed to. God is going to do that for you. Moving on, verse 19 and 20, the angel of God who was going in front of the Israelite forces moved and went behind them. The pillar of cloud moved from in front and then stood behind them. It came from the Egyptian and Israelite it came between the Egyptian and Israelite forces. There was a cloud of darkness. It lit up the night, and neither group came near the other all night long. So we have this pillar of fire. It's between the Israelites and the Egyptians. And it's leading the Israelites, right? They would set up camp, they would do that, they would be led by the pillar of fire. And these two armies, and if you look at the space in like real estate, it's kind of amazing. But these two armies never come in contact. There's always this pillar of fire that's there, okay? God is intervening, in other words. God is intervening. That in the dark, these two people have never, they don't cross forces. They don't cross paths.
I saw that as an Egyptian. I'm saying, no, go back home.
Yeah.
There's your sign.
Right. Really interesting. The book talks about how it goes to show the futility of the Egyptians' plan to stop God's plan. See, we also find an allusion here. We find an allusion here at the Red Sea to another theme often in Scripture, and Brian talked about it just a minute ago, light and darkness. Okay? The Israelites were being led by this pillar of fire. They were walking in the light. Who is the light? God, right? God in the Old Testament, He came down as a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud, right, day or night. He's leading them, right? He is the light. Which is interesting because John 8:12, Jesus is described as the light of the world. Right? 1 John talks about walking in the light. And I don't think it's 1 John would have been a Jew, so I think he's harking back to these kind of stories that we walk by the light. Not necessarily just walking in the light, like don't do bad things, but you're literally walking in the light. You're walking in the presence of God. You're trusting in him, in other words. And if you look at the context of 1 John, it's all about trusting in God and who he is. And so it's not necessarily talking about moral behaviors, but talking about trusting God. If you walk in the light, you have fellowship with him. If you walk in the darkness, you do not. If you're walking in his light that he provides and his deliverance that he provides, you have fellowship with him. If you trust yourself, your own behavior, your own righteousness, your own past, present, or future, if you trust that in yourself, you're not walking in his light. You're trusting yourself. You're trusting yourself. Which leads us to point 3, and it's 10:22. Okay, I'll get off at 10:44. Tell Carl. Okay, but it's point 3. This is where things get really interesting. And if anyone sees my book, it's like this is where I inked at it the most. But it's really interesting stuff here. So Exodus 14, starting in verse 21. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back with a powerful east wind all that night and turned the sea into dry land, so the waters were divided. So they're trapped in between the Egyptians and the Red Sea, and God parts the Red Sea. Now, it's interesting here is we're going to talk about themes a bit. Now, we talked about themes last week. Okay? A theme is something that we get introduced into the Bible, and we see that theme at different points throughout the entire biblical story, and we see it somehow fulfilled in Jesus. Okay? Last week we talked about covenant. Covenant is a theme we see throughout the Old Testament. God makes numerous covenants. We have the Adamic covenant, the Noahic covenant, the Davidic covenant, the Abraham's covenant, right? The covenant with Jacob, the covenant with Moses. I mean, Israelites. That's the covenant of the law that we'll see here in a few chapters. Covenant is a theme that comes all the way throughout, and we see it fulfilled in Jesus. The final faithful covenant partner with God is God. Okay? And so that's important because we have 2 themes that we're going to look at in this section. Okay? The first of which we're going to talk about just a little bit because next week we're going to spend a lot of time on it. And it's the theme of the East. Okay? In the Old Testament, you'll see the East used quite often. Okay? And we see east wind here. And it's not to say that maybe it did not actually blow from the east, but that's not the point of why east is in there. Okay? Next week, we're going to talk about how this is fulfilled, but just note this. The east is a theme that comes out throughout the Old Testament. We talked about it a little bit last week. I just introduced it. We see it here, and let's just say it typically has a negative connotation when coming from human beings, and a judgment or God rendering a judgment on evil people when east is referred to coming from God. So we'll talk about that and why it's important next week, but just know that east is a theme. And once you know a theme in the Bible, it's really cool because who here has a hard time reading the Old Testament sometimes? Yes, right? One of the things is once you start to catch themes, then the Old Testament starts to pop and get exciting again. Because we've heard a lot of these stories, and maybe sometimes it's not as exciting, but when we have a theme, when you see a covenant as you're reading through and you're kind of bored, Numbers chapter 9, you're like, oh gosh, and then you see a covenant, you're like, ooh, why is this here? Because a covenant is important here, and a covenant was important here. Why is it important here, and how does it tie to Jesus? And you start to see the themes. Same thing with the East. We'll see this, and yes, the East is fulfilled in Jesus, and we'll look at that. But there's another theme that happens here. Okay? God is leading his people through the Red Sea. The Old Testament is full of themes of God delivering his people through the waters. Okay? How did creation happen in the biblical narrative? What was God's Spirit doing? Hovering over the waters, right? Over the deep. Okay? And if you actually study that word in Hebrew, it's like chaos waters. Right? And so out of chaos water, God created everything. Okay? And then we see God deliver Noah and his family through the flood, through the waters. Okay? What's even interesting, even in the story of Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah, he pulls Lot and his family out. Fire falls down, but it's described as what? Rain. It rains from, it's fire, but it rains from heaven, right? We see this story where God leads his people through the water here in the Red Sea. We see Joshua leading through, and there's multiple other examples of God delivering his people through the water. Now, is there a New Testament functionality that involves water for Christians? Living water, yeah. But what's symbolism? Baptism. Baptism. Now, in any of the cases, was the water what saved the people? No, God led, but the water became the symbolism of deliverance in the Old Testament story. That's fulfilled in Jesus, right? Jesus came, he went baptized. People wonder, like, why did he become baptized? Why is that important? It's important because it fulfills the entire Old Testament story about deliverance through the water. Right? Baptism is the symbol of the deliverance that God did through his people. He anointed Jesus through his baptism. Okay? He's the one. Remember, this is when God came in and says, "This is my son who I am well pleased." Okay? He can't say that about any of us unless we're in Jesus. So it's a fulfillment of an Old Testament story, an Old Testament theme. Guys, that's extremely important. So I'm trying my best. It may be hard, but I'm trying my best to make the Old Testament exciting again. Because it is exciting. Because it looks forward to Jesus. So as you're reading through and you see someone, an example of the Israelites or someone being delivered through water in the Old Testament, understand that's pointing forward to Jesus. I mean, just off the top of my head, another one is David went down to a stream and picked 5 stones. The interesting thing is he didn't even have, he used one of those stones. But yet it was still through water, through a stream in which God delivered the Israelites through the Philistines. There's numerous examples. I haven't even touched on all of them, but it's a theme that's throughout the Old Testament. And it comes to fulfillment. We know that all these stories are pointing towards the fact that God delivered us. And our example of that as Christians is baptism. Okay? It's the symbol of the deliverance. So the Israelites would always look back at what God did at the Red Sea, right here in this story. He divided the waters. And we get to look back at our baptism and use that as a symbol of what God did in our life, in our eternities, with our sin. He delivered us from it. We see Moses stretching out his hand. We see it in verse 21. We see it again in verse 26. And this stretched out his hand is recalling God's outstretched arm. If you look back at the 10 plagues, God tells Moses, "I'm going to stretch out my arm against Egypt." And what we see is this example of time and time and time again as Moses outstretches his arm. We even see it when he's holding up the bronze serpent, right? And they're winning the battle, right? And the outstretched arm becomes a symbol of God's action that's happening here. So there's a few things that are interesting. These references to Moses' outstretched hand and the east wind we talked about also go back to a very specific plague. Does anyone know what plague these deal with? The locusts. That's exactly right. If you go back to Exodus 10 and you read Exodus 10, you read about the plague of the locusts. The locusts come into Egypt, and Pharaoh is begging, "Please, take them away." So God outstretches his hand, and all the locusts go into the Red Sea. And none of them are left. Now, this is important symbolism because look what happens. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. This is back in our narrative here. And at daybreak, the sea returned to its normal depth. While the Egyptians were trying to escape from it, the Lord threw them into the sea. The water came back and covered the chariots and horsemen, plus the entire army of Pharaoh that had gone after them into the sea. Not even one of them survived. If you look at that story in Exodus 10, they're almost exactly the same story, except one happens to locusts, one happens to Egyptians. God was foreshadowing to the Egyptians what was going to happen to them. Right? He's foreshadowing what's going to happen. See, here's the deal. We see this great story. We've probably, those of us who have been in church a while, we've heard this story numerous times. The Israelites cross the Red Sea parts, Egyptians try to go across, God closes it up. It makes a great movie if anyone's ever seen the Exodus movie. It makes for great scenes and all of that. But here's the thing. The thing that's really interesting about this is what it tells us about Jesus. What it does looking forward. Scripture repeatedly points to the Exodus as a sign and a symbol of our eternal salvation. It's about our eternal salvation. And what's interesting about this story is that the Israelites had very little faith through it. Very little faith. Okay? God worked great things with people that had very small faith. Sometimes we get the impression that God's not going to do great things spiritually in us because we don't trust Him enough, we don't have enough faith, or maybe we're not good enough Christians because we don't have enough faith. That's what deliverance is about. Israelites did nothing to earn the deliverance that they got. Author and pastor Tim Keller has to say this: you are not saved because of the quality of your faith. You are saved because of the object of your faith. The Israelites were not saved because they were going to be faithful either. This is hard because sometimes as Christians we think God saved me, therefore I need to live this perfect, flawless life. No, He saved you because you cannot go and live the perfect and flawless life. He delivered you from the need to go live the perfect life. Instead, He delivered you to trust Him that He lived that life. And the more you trust Him, yes, the better you'll walk with Him. This is true. But it's not about that. It's about trusting Him. It's about the object of your faith, not how much faith you have. Because there are people here this morning that may have more faith than they've ever had. And there's some of this morning that is on the brink of atheism. And God has delivered you both. If you trust in Him, it's not about the quality of your faith. It's not about the quality of your life. It's about the God who delivered and saved you. And the more you understand that, the more trust and quality and behaviors and all those things will fall into line over time. Okay? But it's not about those things. It's about trusting the one who delivered. If we look at the Israelites, and I'll wrap up with this. If we look at the Israelites, if we look at the Red Sea, we look at the plagues we talked about, if we look at the wandering in the wilderness that we're about to get into, if we look at all of these things, we're going to see a major theme. God loves, saves, and delivers people that do not trust Him very much. They're not great moral examples. The Israelites would not win Person of the Year. They're not going to be featured on Time Magazine, Person of the Year. They're not going to be, many of our biblical characters wouldn't be allowed in some of our churches. Let's be real. But here's the thing. God used them because they had even a little bit of faith.